So, I liked how my Matrix video turned out, and I've decided to make another video in the same vein, where I look at a beloved film and see how well it stands the test of time. And finding a new movie to review was as easy as logging onto Netflix and seeing that the whole trilogy was available for streaming. I'll get more creative with my next movie choice, I promise. Anyway, this one's going to be a special episode because I'll be reviewing the whole trilogy. All three of these movies are absolute classics, and I'd seen each of them at least once going in, but I hadn't seen Temple of Doom or Last Crusade in a long time, and I was a little surprised by how they turned out. Before we get to the sequels, let's start with the one that started it all, Raiders of the Lost Ark. I knew I loved this movie, and it also seemed to be the most universally acclaimed installment of the entire franchise. So, is this movie as good as you remember? The short answer is probably yes. I honestly think that Raiders is one of the best action movies ever made. There is not a single moment in this film that falls flat or overstays its welcome. Even the opening scene in the South American temple may not be tied too directly to the overall story, but it's more than worth its spot in the runtime for two reasons. One, it's just incredibly entertaining and perfectly sets the vibe for the whole franchise, and maybe contains more iconic shots than any other 13 minutes in film history. And two, it perfectly establishes what a scumbag Belloc is and opens the narrative with a major failure on Indy's part. Hey look, a starting point for a character arc and a satisfying conclusion. Once the real plot unfolds, I am just amazed by how many clever twists and turns the creators managed to put into such a simplistic story. So, the Nazis want the Ark of the Covenant, and Indy needs to find the staff that will reveal its location. But wait, it turns out that his ex-girlfriend has the staff, and the Nazis are following him to her place. That's okay, the heroes fight their way out and arrive in Egypt. But wait, Marion gets captured, and the Nazi guy is using the scar on his hand to find the entrance to the Well of Souls. That's okay, Belloc's hubris causes him to miss a vital piece of information. But wait, Indy and Marion get too cocky and let themselves get discovered by Belloc at the last minute, and so on. Combine this with the thrilling action, and you practically don't even need well-realized characters. But this movie has them in spades. Belloc, Sala, the Nazi spy guy whose name I can't remember, and especially Marion are so fun to watch. They're developed just enough for me to see them as real people, the performances are fantastic, they all have multiple awesome moments, and they get shit done. Which is much more than I can say for a lot of the supporting characters in the later films. And I've got to talk about the action scenes. Sweeping camera work, incredible set pieces, excellent physical acting, and most importantly of all, a constant sense of tension. Indy spends this entire movie being betrayed, hunted down, captured, and outgunned. Not until the very end did I ever feel like he was on top of things. Despite this though, and despite the fact that the film doesn't shy away from violence, it's incredibly easy to watch throughout its entire runtime and has plenty of great humor even in the chase scenes, like the scene where Marion gets carried in a basket and Indy walks into an entire plaza full of them. The music is amazing as well, but that's a surprise to no one. I mean, it's John Williams, come on. Overall, this is just a perfect action-adventure romp. If you're bored and have Netflix, you should absolutely turn it on. Alright. On to the sequel, Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom. Critically speaking, this movie is still very well received, though not quite to the extent of Raiders, and from what I can tell, the general public seems to have a similar opinion. After I've rewatched this movie, though, I honestly don't really like it. I actually think it's kind of bad. It's just a direct downgrade from the original in every conceivable way. At best, it's a very mixed bag. There are some things that Temple does almost as well as its predecessor. There's some witty dialogue, but not as much as in Raiders. There's a sense of exploration and wonder with great set pieces and cinematography, but not as much as in Raiders. There are some very tense moments, but not as many as in Raiders. The performances are good, but not as good as in Raiders. And beyond that, there are at least three things that are way worse, so let's get into them. One of the best things about Raiders is that all of the major characters are incredibly likable, not just Indy, but the sidekicks and villains as well. The supporting characters in Temple of Doom are fucking awful. Let's start with Short Round. He is pretty obnoxious for about half his screen time, and there's pretty much no explanation as for why he's there, but he does have some funny lines, and I guess as far as kid sidekicks go, he could be a lot worse. Willie, on the other hand, might actually be the most annoying character that I have ever seen in a beloved movie like this. I actually think that more than half of her dialogue consists of screams, and the other 40% consists of some variety of, "Oh my god, I don't want to be here," or "Hey Indy, sorry I fucked up your plan for the billionth time." She doesn't even remotely work as a love interest for Indy either. These two people couldn't be more different, and they have no reason to go for each other than shallow, lustful attraction. The only good scene with Willie is the one where Indy is looking for the secret door and feeling the statue when she thinks he's coming in to have sex with her. And that's only because it's a joke making fun of their lack of chemistry. And as for her utter incompetence, I would at least maybe tolerate it a little if she had some reason to be on the adventure. But nope, she just randomly decides to tag along with Indy in his plane even though she had a perfect chance to leave and would logically want nothing to do with him after he ruined her show. In Raiders, the sidekicks solved way more problems than they caused, and saved Indy's ass on multiple occasions. In Temple of Doom, we have this little kid who literally presses the big scary button for funsies, and this lady who can't lay down in a fucking bed without falling over. This would be unacceptable in any movie, but after Marion, it actually feels like the creators are punching me in the face. The few times that the Temple sidekicks do something useful, it's mostly because the plot feels contrived or the bad guys look like bumbling buffoons. And this brings me into my next point, the action sequences. I know that these movies are pretty far from a true sense of gritty realism, and that over-the-top escapism is ultimately what Indiana Jones is all about. But still, the fight scenes in Raiders felt like larger-than-life conflicts between real people, and it seemed like Indy was a mortal human who could actually lose. The fights in Temple of Doom are right out of a Saturday morning cartoon. Right from the opening scene where Indy plays hide-and-go-dodge bullets behind a rolling gong that doesn't fall flat on his face and then tumbles 6 stories through conveniently placed awnings, it becomes clear to me that Indy and company won't be physically able to lose. And this sentiment becomes even clearer when they end up skydiving hundreds if not thousands of feet on an inflatable boat and crash down on an obstacle-covered slope, twice in a row, with no sign of injury. This isn't about the heroes being clever or badass or resourceful, it's just slapstick and dumb luck, and slapstick does not work in an action movie where the heroes are supposed to look vulnerable. It doesn't really get any better from there. The scene where Indy and crew are all captured in the temple and the mine begins with some real tension, but the way they solve it is basically them just realizing, hey, I was faking being under control this whole time. We're the main characters, and if we just believe in ourselves, we can beat the shit out of these armed warriors, possibly twice our size and 5 times our number, with nothing but our bare fisticuffs without breaking a sweat. It's bad enough when Indy wins fights like this, but when Shorty is doing it, it's patently absurd. Also, it seems to be established that none of the bad guys have guns, except in the minecart scene, a handful of guys just take them out, but even then they aim like drunk stormtroopers using trackpads. I wouldn't have had a problem with this if they didn't show up in this scene. You're telling me that nobody here or here had a gun? They would have been pretty useful there. Also, Mola Ram dumps this sizable bucket of water down the tunnel that should maybe flow around 20 feet Indy's way, not create a raging river that'll tear through the fucking cliff. And these issues do go on, but I don't want to keep talking about them since I'm getting tired, and especially since I have one more thing that I'm not too excited to talk about either. I wish I had an easier way to say this, but Temple of Doom is pretty culturally insensitive. Now, I've never sought out to be the guy who tries to inject social justice into his commentary on movies about finding magic rocks, and I definitely don't think I'm much of an authority on what is and isn't offensive, but I found this movie to be ridden with so many colonialist tropes that it really did detract from my experience. Let me basically restate the plot of this movie. Indy is a white alpha male explorer who winds up in India. The starving locals welcome him, treat him like royalty, and some of them even claim that he was sent by their god. Then he learns that there's a problem that only he can solve, and gets introduced to their super exotic food and religion, which are both portrayed as vile and strange. Then he goes on an adventure through spooky temples, fights an over-the-top villain with a bone headdress, proves to know as much or more about their culture than they do, and single-handedly changes their society for the better, with none of the more sympathetic natives attempting to question his leadership at all. The only time that Indy and company are helped by someone else, it's at the end of the movie when they're saved by the literal colonial military. All of this adds up to something that really does bring down my enjoyment for the movie, since it reminds me of how this way of thinking was used to justify some horrible, horrible actions. I honestly wouldn't feel comfortable watching Temple of Doom with my Indian friends. Raiders has just a little bit of this problem as well, but nowhere near the same magnitude, especially after the first scene. And I know that these movies are inspired by old pulp magazines and serials, which I'm sure were full of cultural insensitivity and sometimes outright racism. But these modernized successors are supposed to get rid of that stuff, just like they're supposed to get rid of the contrived narratives and flat characters. Temple of Doom doesn't do a great job at correcting any of those things, and it's a very disappointing movie in my book. Then we have The Last Crusade, which is just a top-tier adventure movie with likable characters and exciting action sequences that never wastes a second of its runtime. In other words, it's everything an Indiana Jones movie should be. Its plot structure is very similar to Raiders, revolving around Indy finding clues to the location of a biblical artifact before the Nazis can beat him to it. But it also more subtly pulls from some of the better elements of Temple of Doom, like the character arc where he discovers that preservation is more important than fortune and glory. You wouldn't have seen the Indy from the beginning of last movie give this up. Overall, this entire movie is pretty great, but I think that the first scene and last scene in particular are both spectacular, and on par with the best scenes from Raiders. The opening scene with River Phoenix as a young Indy, may he rest in peace, is just so cleverly executed and fun to watch, and perfectly shows a new side of the character while also connecting itself to the rest of the film's story. And the entire third act, from when the Brotherhood attacks the tank to when the credits roll, is just a perfect conclusion to the story that never really lets go, in terms of both thrilling action and compelling emotional drama. Speaking of that, this movie has much more interpersonal drama than its predecessors, which isn't saying much, but I do think that the addition of the father-son relationship and the forbidden love between Indy and Elsa really does help add depth to the franchise. In fact, I think that The Last Crusade has the best supporting characters of the entire trilogy, since they're both likable and nuanced. If I had to choose between this movie and Raiders, I'd still choose Raiders because this one isn't quite as clever or original, and the sequence when Indy and his dad escape the castle has just a little too much ridiculousness to take seriously as a tense rescue scene. It's still amazing though. If you're bored and have already seen the first recently, go watch this movie. So that does it. Just one little blunder in an otherwise fantastic trilogy. Nobody has ever made any Indiana Jones movies since The Last Crusade, and to be honest, they probably shouldn't. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you all next time. Alright, I guess we're gonna have to talk about the gopher in the room. Indiana Jones and the Kingdom of the Crystal Skull was released in 2008, 19 years after The Last Crusade, and this is the only one that I had never seen before making this video. I went in expecting to hate it, since nobody that I've known on the internet or in person likes this movie. On the other hand though, I knew that it has a surprisingly high score on Rotten Tomatoes. So now that I have seen it, how bad is this movie? After watching it, I can say that it is not that good, but maybe not quite as terrible as some people say it is. It's obviously intended to be a nostalgia fest, and it pretty much works as that, but that means that the biggest problem is that it doesn't really bring anything new to the series. The plot structure, again, is almost identical to that of Raiders and The Last Crusade. Indy finds some sort of clue to the location of a supernatural treasure, tries to get there before the bad guys do, is captured and betrayed along the way, and eventually finds the treasure, but doesn't keep it because he knows better than the bad guy who lets it destroy them. I know that these movies are going to have recurring themes, but they can't just be the same story over and over again, and I commend Temple of Doom in retrospect for having a more contained and small-scale story. That said, there are a few places where this movie does diverge from the original, so let's talk about them. There are a handful of new supporting characters in this movie who are mostly not as good as the characters in Raiders or Last Crusade, but still better than the ones in Temple of Doom. A lot of people hate Shia LaBeouf in this movie, but I don't. I think he makes a decent foil as a fresh-faced and headstrong protege to the now jaded and washed-up Indy, and I'm honestly fine with him being Marion's son. But did he have to be Indy's son? Absolutely not. The father-son dynamic that emerges isn't awful, but I think it would have been better if it wasn't based on blood relations. Speaking of Marion being in this movie, she's incredibly forgettable. The badass you expected from Raiders is completely gone. She's just a stereotypical mom now, and has approximately 0 cool moments. Professor Oxley just kind of serves his purpose as a plot device, being the eccentric old guy who guides the heroes to the temple but has been driven mad by the skull's power. In this guy, Mac, his performance is watchable enough, but his character doesn't really make any sense. He betrays Indy at the beginning of the movie, then goes back to his side around the end of the second act, then betrays him again right at the climax, and then sort of maybe goes back to his side just before he dies. It's really not clear, and it doesn't make sense either way. If he was on the bad guy's side the whole time, he shouldn't have saved Indy in the jungle. And if he was on the good guy's side the whole time, he shouldn't have betrayed him in the first place. The most logical conclusion is that he changes his mind at some point, but the character development is just not visible. There aren't a lot of other new additions to the franchise in Crystal Skull, but the ones that are there are largely negative. The 50s setting is done pretty well. The portrayal of the Red Scare almost seems like a parody, but I wouldn't be surprised if people were actually that crazy paranoid about communism back in the day. Besides that, this movie also introduces aliens to the Indiana Jones mythos, which is kind of a weird move, considering how difficult it is to reconcile that with the more religious themes of the original trilogy. Plus, the alien itself looks like garbage. From more of a filmmaking perspective, this movie obviously relies a lot more on CGI than previous installments, and a lot of the CGI just does not look convincing. And to be honest, it really dates the movie. Like, those original movies were timeless. They didn't feel like 80s movies. But Kingdom of the Crystal Skull absolutely feels like a late 2000s movie. But even given the distinctive presence of these new elements, the movie just feels tired, much like Indy himself at this point. This movie is just so obviously recognizable as a worse version of Raiders and the Last Crusade that it feels like it overstays its welcome way too early. Some of the repeated plot points don't even make any sense, like, why is Indy still so hesitant to believe in the supernatural after drinking from the fucking Holy Grail itself? Also, the cartoonish action has just gone too far. Whenever I see a shot like this, or this, or this, I'm reminded of the fact that none of the main characters are really in any danger at all, and I lose any investment in the action scenes. It's not like it was particularly easy to care about this movie to begin with, though. I dislike this movie just a little bit more than Temple of Doom, because when Temple of Doom was bad, at least it was pretty funny most of the time, whereas when this movie is at its worst, it's just incredibly boring. The only reason I might change my mind and say that Temple of Doom is worse is because of its problematic portrayal of Indian culture, but this movie has plenty of those problems as well. They just don't take up quite as much of the runtime. If you've seen all the originals and are really hungry for some more Indiana Jones adventure, then that's mostly done competently, in my opinion, but otherwise you should really give this movie a pass. So yeah, that actually concludes the series, and given how much the fifth film has been pushed back, I don't think there will be any more installments for a long time, if at all. Even though I'm not a big fan of the even-numbered movies, I would still consider myself a fan of Indiana Jones, and there's plenty of fun to be had rewatching them, especially 1 and 3. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed the video, and I'll try to continue this series in the near future. See y'all later!